In 1837, as our expedition pressed deeper into the lowland jungles south of the Usumacinta River, we sought only to document the overgrown remains of Mayan settlements recently rumored by traders and local guides. We expected ruins, carvings, perhaps untouched chambers sealed by roots and time. What we did not expect were signs of something no explorer's report had ever hinted at, something so immense and so deliberate that it challenged the very boundaries of natural history. Long impressions in the soil, stones displaced in patterns no storm could arrange, and a silence across the forest floor so complete it seemed imposed rather than accidental. Before we understood what we were witnessing, we found ourselves within a city swallowed by vegetation, watched by something that moved without sound and carried a weight in the earth heavier than any jaguar or constrictor. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thank you. I joined the expedition as a chronicler, charged with documenting antiquities and sketching architectural details so they might be compared with accounts from Stevens and the earlier Spanish records. Our party consisted of 9 men, surveyors, 2 naturalists, a mapmaker, laborers hired from the river towns, and myself. We carried crates of paper, charcoal, instruments, and enough salted meat and hardtack to last several weeks. Yet even in the earliest days of our approach, something felt unusual. The villagers who guided us to the jungle's edge did not warn us of spirits or gold-seeking bandits as many had done in previous journeys. Instead, they offered no warnings at all. They merely refused to accompany us beyond a certain ridge, stating only that the forest beyond was claimed, and that no one who walked there without purpose returned unchanged. When pressed for clarity, they diverted their gazes and repeated that the land ahead belonged to something older than the ruins. We began our trek with the measured optimism of men confident in their training. The first days carried the familiar rhythm of any expedition through tropical country. The air thickened with humidity, our shirts clung to our backs, and the chorus of insects followed us with relentless persistence. The trees grew taller as we advanced, some rising like pillars of a forgotten cathedral, their roots as broad as walls. Vines draped from every branch, and the scent of wet earth never fully left our senses. I took frequent notes, studying patterns in the masonry fragments, half hidden beneath the soil. The signs of a once-inhabited region grew more frequent after the first week. Stones carved with geometric patterns, fragments of obsidian blades, and raised surfaces barely distinguishable from natural ridges until brushed clear. Yet alongside these encouraging finds came unease. Birds were fewer in this region. The chattering troops of monkeys we had heard earlier in our journey fell increasingly silent. Even the common rustling of small mammals in the undergrowth seemed oddly absent. Our naturalist, Dr. Larkin, suggested that some large predator might range nearby, perhaps jaguars or a pack of unusually bold wolves. But even he could not explain the strange impressions we found on the 4th morning broad troughs pressed into the soil, smooth, deliberate, and curving in a manner that suggested great weight sliding rather than stepping. He measured the width with a length of canvas, nearly 3 feet across at its broadest, tapering at the edges with a smooth precision that defied casual explanation. No serpent native to these regions, no matter how large, matched the span before us. We proceeded cautiously, but without altering our intended route. The impressions grew more intermittent as the terrain shifted to rocky outcrops. Toward evening, we established camp beneath a cluster of ceiba trees. Their great white trunks rose high above us, lifting branches into a canopy so lofty that even the encroaching dusk hesitated to settle fully beneath their boughs. The day's fatigue weighed heavily on the men. Some sharpened machetes, others tended to their blistered feet. I sketched the ceiba trunk nearest the fire, marking the unusual spirals of vine that had crept around its base like sleeping serpents. The light faded slowly. One by one, the men settled into their hammocks, strung between roots that rose taller than a man. Sometime after midnight, a faint shudder traveled through the ground. It was not the tremor of an animal passing near the camp, nor the shift of earth caused by falling branches. It was long, steady, and heavy enough that the water in my tin cup rippled as if disturbed by an unseen hand. I lay still, listening. The forest remained silent in that unnatural way it had for days, absent of insects, absent of night birds, absent of anything but the soft crackle of our dying fire. The ground pulsed again, not sharply, but in a slow, dragging rhythm, as though something vast moved with deliberate weight. I raised myself slightly in my hammock, straining to hear more. The movement did not approach, nor did it recede. It passed at a distance, silent except for that muted tremor. In the morning, the men spoke quietly of uneasy dreams, though whether they dreamed at all was uncertain given how frequently they awakened at night. When we packed our gear to resume the journey, we discovered an unsettling detail near the northern edge of the camp. A broad section of leaf litter had been cleared away in a long, sweeping arc. Beneath the disturbed vegetation lay soil smoothed flat, streaked with parallel lines as though brushed by a heavy, scaled surface. Dr. Larkin knelt beside it, tracing the marks with a gloved hand. He noted that the spacing of the ridges was even almost architectural in regularity impossible for any known serpent. No one spoke further on the matter. Fear remained unspoken, held behind the determination that drove us deeper into the jungle. By midday we reached a ridge where the ground sloped downward toward a basin filled with towering ferns and strangler figs. At the far end of that basin, half obscured by vines, stood the first stones of a Mayan structure. The sight renewed the men's resolve. Even from a distance, the stonework showed the crisp geometry characteristic of the civilization's step terraces, carved reliefs, and symmetrical platforms emerging from the jungle's grasp. We descended carefully, hacking through dense undergrowth thick with twisted roots. The air grew heavier as we approached the ruins, laden with the scent of damp limestone and decaying foliage. The structures revealed themselves in stages. First a low platform with collapsed stairways, then a line of weathered stele bearing images eroded into anonymity. Then, rising above all else, the facade of a temple partially intact despite the centuries. Its upper tiers leaned beneath the weight of roots thicker than a man's torso. Creeping vines had dragged portions of the wall downward, splitting the stone in places. Yet much remained recognizable intricate carvings of serpents, intertwined with celestial symbols, their bodies winding in endless loops around the outer walls. We cleared a small area at the temple's base to make camp, though the men did so without the relief they might otherwise have felt. The air near the ruins held a curious stillness. A faint breeze rustled the canopy above, but the ground-level vegetation hardly moved. Even the insects seemed reluctant to approach the shadow of the temple. When Dr. Larkin climbed the first tier to inspect the carvings more closely, he paused abruptly, then motioned for me to join him. Near the stairway, carved into the stone, lay a serpent of extraordinary size. Its scales were rendered with remarkable detail, each larger than a man's hand. The creature's head bore a frilled crest, and its eyes were depicted as deep-set with elliptical pupils. Yet the most arresting detail was the serpent's body. It coiled around the entire facade in one unbroken motion, looping behind pillars and re-emerging at precise intervals. The artistry suggested reverence, perhaps even fear. Beneath the serpent's head, a series of glyphs repeated in a pattern that neither of us could fully decipher. Dr. Larkin remarked that it resembled the Mayan symbol for a guardian or watcher, though the context was unclear. The carvings continued across the fallen stones scattered at the base of the structure. I knelt beside one such fragment and brushed away the loose soil. Beneath my hand I uncovered a depression carved deliberately into the stone, wide, shallow, and smooth, as though intended to hold water or offerings. But what unnerved me was the faint pattern etched around its perimeter, a series of concentric lines, each slightly raised, resembling the ripple marks of a great serpent's passage. As evening settled around the ruins, we prepared our camp with a blend of curiosity and caution. The temple's presence brought both comfort and unease, a reminder of human ingenuity and yet a testament to forces that shaped civilizations long vanished. The men lit a fire near the base of the stairway. Shadows from the flames danced across the serpent relief, giving the impression that the stone itself shifted in the flickering light. During the night's quiet, I walked the perimeter of our camp to ensure our supplies were secure. Near the edge of the clearing, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. Half buried beneath a mat of leaves lay a stone slab, its surface cracked, but still bearing the faint remnant of paint. I brushed away the loose soil. A mural emerged, faded greens and reds, depicting a human figure standing before an enormous serpent that towered above him, its head raised higher than the tallest tree in the background. The human figure held offerings: a bowl, a feathered staff, and what might have been maize or flowers. The serpent's eyes were painted in deep red, the pigment barely faded by time. I called the others to see it. Dr. Larkin studied the fragment for a long time, his brow furrowed. He remarked that the proportions of the serpent were clearly symbolic. No creature of such scale could logically exist in the region. Yet he said this without conviction. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The mural's composition suggested worship rather than exaggerated fear, but the context remained elusive. We retired to our hammocks under the ceiba trees, each man wrapped in his own unsettled thoughts. The fire burned low, casting thin wisps of smoke into the night. As I attempted to sleep, I listened closely to the jungle. It remained still too still for a region so biologically active. By habit, I marked this in my journal, noting the contradictory nature of the ruins, places of life yet enveloped by silence. Deep into the night, I awoke to a faint scraping sound. It came from the direction of the temple stairway. At first I believed it to be the shifting of roots, or perhaps an animal moving through loose stone. But then the sound repeated, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Something brushed against the limestone, dislodging a few pebbles that tumbled down the steps. I strained to see through the darkness. The faint glow of the dying fire cast irregular shadows, none of which formed a clear shape. Then a second sound followed, a soft exhalation, low and resonant, unlike any animal breath I had heard before. Several of the men stirred in their hammocks. Dr. Larkin rose slowly, peering toward the dark outline of the temple. No one spoke. The breath sounded again steady, deep, and strangely muted, as if drawn from lungs vast enough to muffle their own force. After a long moment, the sound faded. Whatever had passed near the stairway retreated into the deeper shadows beyond the ruins. In the morning, we examined the location where the noise had originated. Near the base of the steps, the dust had been disturbed in a wide arc. The stone bore fresh scratches, smooth, shallow grooves that curved with a precision suggestive of a scaled surface sliding against the limestone. The pattern was identical to the impressions we had seen days earlier on the forest floor. Dr. Larkin knelt to study the marks. He measured the width again, confirming they matched the earlier troughs. The expression on his face darkened. We chose to continue our survey despite the unease. Our purpose here was too important to abandon, and we believed, perhaps foolishly, that daylight brought a degree of safety. We climbed the temple steps carefully, mindful of loose stones. At the top, we found a wide platform partially collapsed under the weight of centuries of growth. Beyond the platform lay a series of interconnected chambers, their entrances framed by stone pillars overtaken by vines. Inside, faint carvings lined the wall scenes of rituals, celestial diagrams, and repeated depictions of the great serpent ensnaring stars, rivers, and men alike. One chamber stood apart from the rest. Its entrance was narrower, and the stone around the doorway bore fewer carvings. When we entered, we discovered a long, shallow depression carved directly into the floor. It stretched nearly the length of the room and curved slightly at the end. The stone within the depression was polished smooth, unlike the rough surfaces surrounding it. At first we believed it a channel for water or offerings, but as we studied the curvature and width, a chilling thought arose. It resembled nothing so much as the resting place of something long, heavy, and alive. As we emerged from the chamber, a gust of wind passed over the ruins, rustling the vines. Then a sudden snap echoed through the courtyard. One of the vines near the lower terrace had broken abruptly, as though torn free. Several men rushed to the edge of the platform. Below, the vegetation shifted in long, rhythmic waves, pushing aside leaves and branches. A massive shape moved through the undergrowth, too large to be a serpent of ordinary proportions. The forest parted slightly as it passed, revealing a fleeting glimpse of smooth scales glistening beneath the dappled sunlight. It disappeared before any of us could fully process what we had seen. The courtyard fell silent again, but the tremor in the earth slowly faded, leaving behind a dreadful clarity. We were not alone among these ruins, and the giant snake that moved through this ancient city had been watching us from the moment we arrived. The tremor beneath the earth faded into the same unnatural quiet that had haunted us for days, yet its memory lingered in the nervous glances the men exchanged. No one wished to put into words what had just moved through the undergrowth, an enormity that defied natural explanation. Dr. Larkin stood at the platform's edge a long while, bracing himself with one hand against the stone, his jaw tight with thoughts he refused to speak aloud. As chronicler, I made notes in brief strokes, but my pen felt heavier than usual, as though the ink itself struggled to bear the truth. We descended from the platform and regrouped at the base of the temple. The sun had risen higher, sending shafts of light through breaks in the canopy. Dust motes drifted through the beams, floating lazily as if the world itself hesitated to stir. The men moved with subdued caution, packing tools more quietly, gripping machetes with greater tension, and watching every rustle of leaf with suspicion. Although we had come here to document structures left by an ancient civilization, the ruins around us now seemed less like the remnants of a vanished culture, and more like the threshold of a place still claimed by something older and unwilling to relinquish its domain. We chose to extend our survey to the north side of the complex, where the forest seemed marginally clearer. Even there, roots wrapped themselves over toppled stones in thick contortions, as if the jungle had risen to reclaim what time had abandoned. Moss covered many of the carvings, and ferns spilled over cracked stairways. Our machetes were constantly in motion, brushing back vines and clearing narrow paths through ancient halls. It was during this crossing that we found the first of the altars. It sat in the shadow of a partially collapsed archway, formed from 3 blocks of limestone arranged to create a low platform. Its surface bore a series of shallow depressions, evenly spaced and filled with stagnant water. Dr. Larkin crouched to examine them. His fingertips traced the edges of the depressions, and he noted the faint tool marks suggesting human craftsmanship. Yet the arrangement of the depressions reminded him, uncomfortably, of something he had seen earlier in the smooth troughs pressed into the soil. He said nothing more. The men did not ask. As we moved farther from the temple, the carvings shifted in nature. The serpent motif persisted, but the patterns grew more abstract. Serpents with exaggerated length coiled around symbols representing rivers, stars, and storms. One panel depicted a vast serpent encircling an entire city its body, forming walls around it. Another showed people kneeling before the serpent, their arms raised in gestures of supplication. The glyphs near these scenes appeared more intricate, as though the artisans had taken great care to emphasize their purpose. Dr. Larkin believed they referenced guardian deities or sacred protectors. Yet the scale of the serpent depicted troubled him, for no known species, even in legend, reached such proportions. A short distance beyond the carvings, we encountered a courtyard sunken into the earth, half filled with accumulated debris. The stones lining the perimeter had been displaced, some scattered violently across the area. The arrangement suggested neither collapse nor gradual erosion. Instead, The stones appeared pushed aside by force. Their heavy mass and distance from the wall made the implication deeply unsettling. As we stepped into the courtyard, the ground felt uneven. Beneath a thin layer of soil lay what seemed to be heavily disturbed strata compressed at irregular intervals. At first, we assumed the depressions were remnants of ancient ceremonies, perhaps places where fires had burned. But upon closer inspection, we noticed something more peculiar. The soil bore the faint pattern of overlapping scales, each indentation smooth and elongated. The marks curved in wide arcs, forming a winding track through the courtyard. The track was deep, deep enough to suggest enormous weight, deep enough that the realization stopped us cold. We followed the track with dread, tracing its path toward the base of a leaning structure whose original form we could no longer determine. Dense vines concealed much of its shape. As we approached, a strong scent emanated from within, musky, earthy, tinged with a faint sweetness, like fermenting fruit. The scent grew stronger near a shadowed alcove beneath the ruins. A few of the men stepped back instinctively. The air there felt warmer, moist, and strangely oppressive. Something about the alcove suggested recent disturbance. Leaves had been pushed aside, small stones displaced, and the soil bore fresh, parallel lines. We did not linger. By midday, the heat pressed upon us with merciless weight. The men called for a brief halt, and we rested near a broken stele that cast a narrow strip of shade. The carved surface of the stone depicted a man standing before a serpent of colossal size. This serpent's head rose above the man's height by several times. Its fangs were not bared, but its presence dominated the scene. The man's posture seemed reverent, offering what appeared to be maize or fruit. Dr. Larkin suggested that this might represent a ritual exchange, a symbolic gesture toward a deity. Yet even he seemed unconvinced by his own interpretation. After resting, we made our way toward the eastern boundary of the ruins. The terrain shifted there, sloping gradually downward into a cluster of structures partially consumed by earth. Some buildings had collapsed entirely, forming mounds of stone beneath creeping vines. Others retained fragments of walls and doorways. As we navigated through these remnants, I discovered a stone panel lying face down, nearly hidden beneath a mat of roots. With the help of two men, I pried it upright. Beneath the dirt and moss lay a carved image unlike any we had seen yet. This serpent differed from the others. It was depicted in motion, its body coiled tightly around a stone pillar, suggesting immense strength. Its head faced forward, mouth slightly open, revealing curved fangs. The artisans had carved the scales with astonishing detail. But the detail that struck us most was the size of the head relative to the human figure carved beside it. The serpent was not merely large. It was overwhelming, impossible, fantastic in scale. Yet the carvings had not been stylized in the manner of myth. They lacked the exaggerated flourishes common to symbolic depictions. Instead, they bore the precision of observation, like something seen, remembered, and recorded with care. We pressed deeper into the eastern structures. Several times we heard faint shifts in the brush, like something large brushing against leaves. The sound always came from behind us, prompting the men to turn sharply with their weapons drawn. But nothing emerged. The forest remained still, holding its breath. Near the edge of the eastern complex stood a collapsed tower overgrown with strangler figs. Its base had sunk slightly into the soft earth, creating a narrow gap beneath one of the fallen blocks. Dr. Larkin, ever curious, stooped to look beneath it. A moment later, he recoiled abruptly, urging us to gather. The men crowded around. Beneath the stone lay a shed skin. The skin was immense. Its thickness exceeded that of any serpent we had encountered in our travels. The pattern of scales was broad, ridged, and iridescent even in the shadow. When we drew it out carefully, its length defied belief. Several sections had torn during the shedding process, but when placed end to end, the skin measured more than 30 feet. The men stared in silence. Their faces reflected a mixture of awe and dread. Dr. Larkin examined the skin closely. His hands trembled slightly. He noted the scalation pattern, the wide, overlapping plates that suggested a creature of unusual girth and strength. He pointed out faint scratches along the underside where the skin had dragged across rough stone. The skin was fresh. The edges had not yet dried or curled fully. The creature that left it behind was growing. No one spoke for a long time. The shed skin lay across the ruins like a terrible revelation, its scales catching fragments of sunlight that filtered through the canopy. When we finally rolled it away, the men did so with a mixture of reverence and fear, as though touching something sacred or forbidden. We resumed our survey with heightened vigilance. Every sound in the forest became amplified. Each rustling leaf drew our attention. The ruins now felt less like abandoned structures, and more like a labyrinth in which we were being studied from the shadows. Several times I felt a presence behind me, but when I turned, I saw only vines and drifting dust. Later in the afternoon, we discovered what appeared to be an entrance to an underground chamber. A stairway descended into darkness, choked with roots and debris. We cleared the first few steps and peered into the gloom. A faint draft rose from below, carrying with it the same musky scent we had detected earlier. Dr. Larkin advised caution, but curiosity compelled us. We descended one by one, our lanterns casting wavering circles of light on the stone walls. The chamber opened into a large room, supported by 4 pillars. The walls were adorned with frescoes, though the paint had flaked away in many places. What remained, however, revealed scenes of gatherings, offerings and serpents, coiling protectively around groups of people. The chamber floor bore a single prominent carving, a spiral beginning at the center and widening outward, its depths worn smooth by centuries of use. Near the far wall stood a raised platform. Upon it rested a carved stone vessel, cracked but mostly intact. Inside the vessel lay a thick residue, dark, hardened, and difficult to identify. Dr. Larkin believed it might have been some form of offering material, perhaps ceremonial substances burned during rituals. But the scent rising from the vessel seemed faintly familiar, reminiscent of the musky aroma we associated with the giant snake. The air in the chamber felt heavier the longer we remained. Some of the men complained of dizziness. Others felt a faint vibration beneath their feet. It pulsed irregularly, like the distant movement of something massive shifting far below. We left the chamber quickly. Upon emerging into the sunlight, we found the forest quiet once again. The men appeared weary, more so than the day's exertions alone could explain. The shed skin weighed heavily on everyone's thoughts. The carvings, the scents, the impressions in the soil, all pointed to a presence that defied rational understanding. As evening approached, we returned to our camp near the base of the temple. The dying light cast long shadows across the ruins, and the air grew cooler. We gathered near the fire, speaking in hushed tones. Some men expressed fear of remaining another night in the ruins. Others argued that leaving in haste would be unwise given the dense terrain and failing light. Dr. Larkin suggested we remain, but keep watch in shifts. When darkness settled, the jungle vanished into a wall of blackness beyond our fire's reach. The flames flickered, casting fleeting shapes on the temple walls. I remained awake longer than intended, listening to the stillness. The silence felt oppressive, as though the jungle held its breath in anticipation. Near midnight, a deep, resonant sound echoed through the ruins. It resembled a low rumble, neither roar nor hiss, but something between, as though exhaled from great lungs beneath the earth. The sound reverberated through the stones, causing a slight tremor beneath our hammocks. The fire's flames fluttered. The men stirred nervously. Moments later, another sound followed, a long, dragging sweep across stone, punctuated by brief intervals of silence. It came from the direction of the eastern structures. The dragging grew louder, then stopped abruptly. The stillness returned, yet the air felt charged, as though something vast lingered just beyond the firelight. I gripped the edges of my hammock, forcing myself to breathe steadily. The sound resumed again, closer this time, and a faint shift in the brush. Then the cracking of a root beneath tremendous weight. The giant snake was moving through the ruins. Its presence was unmistakable, its approach deliberate. The fire seemed feeble in the face of such a being. Some of the men rose silently, gripping machetes or rifles, though none dared step beyond the circle of light. The dragging sound circled the edge of our camp. Leaves rustled. A faint ripple passed through the earth. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the temple walls. Then silence. Long, unbroken silence. We waited, barely breathing. After several minutes, the tension eased slightly, though none of us returned to sleep. Some whispered that the serpent had been watching us. Others believed it was warning us, claiming the ruins as its own. As dawn broke, the ruins appeared unchanged. The temple loomed serenely. The forest swayed in the gentle morning breeze. Yet the earth near the eastern structures bore fresh marks deep, curving impressions carved into the soil and stone, smoother and larger than any before. The giant snake had passed through the city during the night, and it had passed closer to our camp than ever before. Morning light reached the ruins in fractured beams, scattering through the canopy like thin blades of gold. It touched the temple stones first, then trickled down the staircases, illuminating the dust suspended above them. The sight might have been beautiful had the memory of the night not lingered with such oppressive weight. Instead, the sun felt like a hesitant visitor, uncertain whether it was safe to enter the domain we had trespassed upon. No one spoke for a long time. The men moved about the camp with subdued caution, each action slower than usual. They gathered their gear in silence, glancing repeatedly toward the eastern boundary where the giant snake had passed. Even those who normally approached mornings with vigor now carried out their tasks with an air of quiet dread. The ground bore unmistakable traces of the serpent's movement. Long, sweeping impressions carved into the soil, some deep enough to cast slight shadows. Broken branches hung limply from trees, and crushed vegetation radiated outward in arcs. These marks formed a path around our camp, as if the creature had circled us deliberately, perhaps evaluating us in the night. Whatever the reason, the evidence was unmistakable. It had chosen proximity over concealment. Dr. Larkin studied the tracks with methodical precision, taking careful measurements despite the tremor in his hands. He crouched beside the deepest impression, pressing his fingers gently into its curve. His expression shifted through several quiet realizations, none of which he shared aloud. When he stood, he brushed the dirt from his palms, yet his gaze remained fixed on the track. He seemed to be weighing possibilities, though none were comforting. We decided to resume our survey toward the southern structures. These lay beyond a low terrace, partially reclaimed by the forest. The terrain there dropped into a shallow depression, where a network of toppled walls formed a labyrinth of stone corridors. Thick vines draped from the higher branches, forming curtains that forced us to cut a path with machetes. The humidity intensified as we descended, and the air felt heavy, almost stagnant. Even the insects seemed reluctant to stir. The men advanced cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the dense accumulation of fallen leaves. The ruins grew more intricate here. Carved doorways framed shadows that swallowed our lantern light, and the walls bore faint frescoes depicting rituals and offerings. The serpent motif persisted throughout, but now the imagery suggested not only reverence, but also fear. Human figures knelt in desperation before the serpent, their arms raised not in worship, but in supplication. Surrounding them, swirling lines evoked movement, cycles, seasons, or perhaps the endless passage of the creature itself. One mural in particular caught our attention. It portrayed a giant snake enveloping a group of people, while a priest or elder stood nearby, holding a torch aloft. The snake's body coiled around the individuals, not crushing them, but enclosing them within a ring. The meaning of this was unclear. Dr. Larkin traced the lines thoughtfully. He offered that the serpent might have been regarded as both guardian and arbiter, a presence neither wholly benevolent nor malevolent, but one demanding respect. As we progressed deeper into the southern complex, the atmosphere shifted. The forest sounds faded until only the faint rustle of leaves remained. Our boots stirred the dust of centuries, sending small plumes drifting through shafts of filtered light. Soon we reached a structure of considerable size, a building with a slanted roof partially collapsed inward. The entrance bore a lintel carved with serpent imagery, though much of it had eroded. We cleared the doorway and stepped inside. The interior felt surprisingly cool. The walls were adorned with reliefs depicting gatherings, processions, and what seemed to be astronomical charts. But the most striking feature of the chamber lay in its center, an immense stone circle embedded into the floor, each segment carved with intricate patterns. At the circle's heart was a depression filled with water, though no source fed it. The stillness of the water's surface contrasted sharply with the dust surrounding it. Some of the men knelt beside the depression, peering into the shallow pool. The water was clear and faintly reflective, though the bottom lay obscured by sediment. When I dipped a finger into the edge, the temperature surprised me. It was warm, warmer than the surrounding air, as though it were heated by some underground current. A faint ripple spread outward from my touch, disturbing the perfect stillness. Then a second ripple formed unprompted, originating from the far side of the pool. One of the men stepped back abruptly. Dr. Larkin raised his lantern higher. The ripple dissipated, leaving the water surface smooth once more. Whether caused by a subtle tremor in the ground or by something resting deeper in the earth, we could not determine. Yet the coincidence of the movement left us uneasy. We spent several hours studying the chamber, sketching the reliefs and documenting the patterns carved into the stone circle. The interpretation remained uncertain, but its purpose felt ritualistic. Perhaps ceremonies had been conducted here, invoking the serpent or honoring it. Or perhaps the room had once served as a place of safekeeping, where people sought to communicate with forces they considered beyond comprehension. When we exited the chamber, the forest greeted us with an uneasy quiet. The light outside had dimmed slightly as the afternoon clouds thickened overhead. As we made our way toward the open courtyard beyond, a faint tremor shook the ground, so subtle that we might have dismissed it as imagination, if not for the reaction of the birds. A sudden flurry erupted from the canopy as several flocks took flight at once, their wings beating frantically. The sound rushed through the trees like a living wave. Leaves shook free in small cascades. The tremor faded, and the forest fell still again. We exchanged glances. Another sign of movement beneath the surface. We regrouped near a corridor of fallen stones. It was here that we heard the first unmistakable sign that the giant snake had not only passed through the ruins earlier, but continued to linger nearby. From the far corner of the complex came a faint scraping, long, steady, rhythmic. It sounded like stone being shifted, or scaled flesh brushing against a wall. The men froze. Dr. Larkin signaled for silence. We listened intently. The scraping continued for several seconds, then ceased. Leaves rustled briefly afterward, then nothing. We surveyed the southern structures more cautiously. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corridor narrower. The ruins formed a maze of sightlines and concealed spaces. It was impossible to see more than a few steps ahead at any given moment. The sensation of being watched increased with each passing minute. The hairs on my arms prickled. My heartbeat quickened despite my attempts to steady it. We reached a courtyard bordered by collapsed walls. In the center lay a large circular platform adorned with carvings of serpents intertwined with celestial symbols. The ground near the platform bore fresh impressions, shallow but distinct, left by something heavy passing through. The direction of the impressions led toward a dense cluster of vines near the eastern archway. It was here that the first partial sighting of the giant snake occurred. One of the men ventured closer to the archway, pushing aside the vines to inspect the carvings underneath. As he did, the vines rustled, not from his movement, but from something beyond them. He stepped back cautiously. The others tightened their grips on their weapons. The vines shifted again, more pronounced this time, as though brushed by something of substantial size. A moment later, through the lattice of leaves, a segment of dark, glossy scales slid into view broad, ridged and iridescent. The segment moved slowly, deliberately, curving around the base of a stone. The color shifted subtly in the dim light, reflecting shades of bronze and green. For an instant, the segment filled our vision. Then it disappeared behind the stone. The men stood rooted in place. No one dared move. My breath caught in my throat. The size of the segment alone suggested a creature of extraordinary mass, far larger than any snake known to science. It moved with fluid precision, neither hurried nor hesitant, as though entirely unbothered by our presence. The vines trembled slightly after the serpent passed. A faint disturbance rippled outward along the ground. Then stillness returned. We retreated slowly from the archway, maintaining a respectful distance. Dr. Larkin urged the men to remain calm and avoid provoking the creature. His voice, though steady, carried a tension that betrayed his own apprehension. As we continued our survey, the serpent's signs became increasingly frequent. We found a toppled statue whose base bore fresh scratches wide, shallow marks, consistent with scaled flesh brushing against stone. A stone slab had been displaced several feet from its original position, its weight far too great for any man to move unaided. In another area, we discovered a cluster of broken branches, forming a tunnel-like path through the undergrowth, wide enough to accommodate something massive. The direction of these signs suggested the serpent was not merely passing through the ruins, it was patrolling them. Our fear deepened when we discovered another shed skin, smaller than the first, but still enormous. This one lay draped over a collapsed stairway. Its edges had dried and curled, suggesting it had been shed earlier than the previous one. The presence of multiple shed skins hinted at either a long-term habitat or the presence of more than one serpent. Neither possibility offered comfort. Late in the afternoon, as the sky grew overcast and a low wind rustled the treetops, we reached the southernmost edge of the complex. Here the land dipped into a depression filled with thick vegetation. The ruins thinned out, replaced by tangled roots and fractured stone. A faint path wound through the center, descending toward a cluster of partially buried structures. It was at the edge of this depression that we encountered the first carcass. A peccary lay sprawled across the roots, its body distorted in a manner reminiscent of the sloth we had discovered earlier. No bite marks, no torn flesh. The ribs had been compressed inward, as though subjected to immense pressure. The tissue around the chest bore smooth, parallel indentations consistent with the scales of the giant snake pressing firmly down. The ground around the carcass was disturbed, forming a shallow, wide depression. The men recoiled at the sight. A few muttered prayers. Dr. Larkin examined the carcass briefly, his face grim. He noted the absence of predatory tearing, a sign the serpent did not kill for food, or at least not exclusively. Its intention remained unclear. We covered the carcass with branches out of respect. Then we moved on. As evening approached, the sky dimmed quickly. A light mist drifted through the forest, softening the outlines of the ruins. We established camp near a partially intact wall that offered some shelter from the wind. The men built a fire within a ring of stones, though its warmth felt weaker than usual, as though the air itself resisted it. Night settled uneasily upon the ruins. The fire cast long shadows across the stones. The men spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely rising above the crackle of burning wood. Dr. Larkin remained silent for a long time, staring into the flames with distant eyes. When he finally spoke, he suggested that the serpent might regard the ruins as its territory, perhaps even as its sanctuary. He theorized that the Mayans had coexisted with the serpent in some capacity, either revering it or fearing it deeply. His words did little to soothe us. As the fire burned low and darkness pressed against our small circle of light, the jungle again fell unnaturally quiet. Then, from somewhere beyond the southern structures, a low rumble sounded deep, resonant, and unmistakably alive. The ground vibrated faintly beneath us. Leaves shivered on their branches. A moment later, the dragging sound returned slow, heavy, rhythmic. It moved through the ruins with deliberate intention, circling once more, as though drawing closer with each pass. The giant snake was not merely a presence in the ruins. It was watching us, measuring us. And with each passing hour, its proximity grew more unnervingly intimate. Sleep came in brief, shallow intervals, never long enough to quiet the senses or soften the vigilance that had wrapped itself around our thoughts. The night pressed heavily upon the ruins, and every faint rustle beyond the glow of the fire became an imagined threat. The men lay in their blankets, eyes half open, fingers resting uneasily near their weapons, though none dared to grip them fully. I drifted in and out of consciousness, each moment of rest interrupted by the memory of scales dragging across stone or the faint tremors that rippled through the earth. When dawn finally arrived, it did so reluctantly. A pale, muted light seeped into the clearing as though afraid to commit itself fully to the place. The air felt cool at first, but beneath the coolness lingered a heavy, almost metallic scent. The fire had burned low, reduced to a few glowing embers. The forest remained subdued, offering only sparse birdsong, as if the creatures of the jungle waited to be certain the great serpent had retreated before resuming their own routines. We rose slowly, each movement stiff from the tension of the night. The men prepared their packs with careful precision, avoiding sudden motions. Dr. Larkin stood apart from the group, studying the perimeter of our camp. He crouched near the wall, where long impressions cut across the soil-fresh tracks left during the night. The impressions merged with older ones, creating a network of intertwined pathways that revealed a chilling truth. The serpent had circled us not once, but several times. Each pass brought it closer, as though narrowing the distance with calculated patience. The atmosphere carried the pressure of unspoken fear, yet our duties remained. Dr. Larkin insisted that we continue the survey of the remaining eastern structures while maintaining a schedule tight enough to return to camp well before dusk. The men agreed, though without conviction. They moved with the subdued determination of those who would rather flee but lacked the means or direction to do so. We set out toward the eastern quarter of the ruins. The path wound through a corridor of standing columns, some still bearing carved figures despite centuries of erosion. The columns led us toward a sunken plaza partially swallowed by vegetation. The ground sloped downward into a wide basin where large blocks of stone lay scattered, as though tossed by a force strong enough to displace them. Vines clung to every surface, weaving themselves between the ruins like veins. At the far end of the plaza, we encountered a temple platform larger than any we had surveyed thus far. Much of its structure had collapsed, leaving only a fragmented staircase and a handful of outer walls. Yet even in its ruin, the building commanded an imposing presence. Carvings along the remaining walls depicted scenes of a serpent coiling around what appeared to be the very structures we stood among. The imagery suggested not destruction, but dominion, a symbol of guardianship or ownership over these ancient halls. The ground near the temple bore more impressions, deeper and more defined than previous ones. The soil here retained moisture, making the serpent's tracks stark and unmistakable. Each impression curved gently, rising and dipping with the fluidity of something immense, moving with effortless grace. The scale of the impressions indicated that the segment we saw the previous day belonged to only a small portion of the creature's length. We moved carefully around the temple's perimeter, documenting the carvings and structural details. The silence pressed heavily upon us. Even the rustling of leaves felt subdued, as though the forest had paused its breathing. The men exchanged occasional glances, their eyes drawn repeatedly toward the shadowed arches and crumbled stairways. It was as if the ruins themselves held breath, waiting for something to emerge. Near midday, a faint tremor pulsed through the ground. It was subtle, little more than a ripple beneath our boots, but unmistakably real. The men stiffened. A few looked toward the path we had taken from camp, as though expecting the serpent to appear there at any moment. The tremor faded quickly, yet its brief intrusion pressed upon our nerves with renewed anxiety. We continued eastward, navigating a series of narrow passageways formed by fallen walls. The air grew warmer and the light dimmer as the canopy thickened overhead. The shadows deepened, making it difficult to discern details beyond a few paces. Our footsteps echoed faintly in the confined spaces, adding a hollow cadence to our movements. It was in one such passageway that we discovered another cluster of carved stones arranged in a circular pattern. The arrangement resembled an altar or ceremonial site. In its center lay a shallow pit lined with polished stones that bore traces of pigment. Faded red and ochre streaks clung stubbornly to the grooves, suggesting rituals once performed here. The serpent motif adorned the stones in spiraling patterns that converged at the center of the pit. As we documented the site, a sudden rustling echoed through the corridor. The sound was not like the wind rushing leaves or the movement of small creatures. It was deeper, more substantial, a shifting of weight along stone. The men froze. Dr. Larkin raised his hand, urging stillness. We listened keenly, straining to distinguish the direction of the noise. It came again, this time closer, a slow, deliberate scrape that resonated through the ruins. Then silence. The air tightened. I felt the pressure of the moment settle into my chest, constricting each breath. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The serpent was not merely passing near the ruins, it was within them. We moved cautiously toward a clearing that opened into a large courtyard. The space felt strangely exposed, framed by arched walls and remnants of towers that cast jagged shadows across the stone floor. At the far edge of the courtyard lay a series of steps descending into darkness. The entrance appeared carved into the earth itself, forming a subterranean passage. The men hesitated at its threshold, instinct urging them to avoid any descent into enclosed spaces where the serpent might linger unseen. Dr. Larkin examined the steps with interest, but refrained from suggesting we explore the passage. The risk outweighed any potential discovery. We instead turned our attention toward a cluster of smaller structures to the north. The layout suggested they once housed priests, scribes, or officials. The walls here bore intricate carvings that portrayed sequences of serpent imagery intertwined with sun and moon symbols. These depictions seemed to offer a cyclical interpretation of the serpent's presence, as though reflecting seasonal movements or rituals tied to celestial events. As we documented the carvings, a sudden, sharp series of cracks echoed from beyond the courtyard. The sound resembled branches breaking under immense pressure. A moment later, a tremor pulsed beneath our feet stronger than before. Dust drifted from the upper edges of the walls. The men stepped back instinctively, their expressions tense. A faint, dragging sound followed, slow, rhythmic, unmistakable. We gathered near the center of the courtyard, forming a tight group. The dragging grew louder, its source approaching from the direction of the sunken plaza. The sound moved with a measured cadence, each shift of weight aligning with the fluid motion of something vast. The men tightened their grips on their weapons, though none raised them. Any aggressive gesture might incite a response we could not withstand. Then, through the archway at the far end of the courtyard, the giant snake emerged into full view. Its head appeared first broad, angular, and adorned with subtle ridges that caught the filtered light. Its eyes glimmered with a deep amber hue, reflecting intelligence rather than simple predation. The serpent paused at the threshold, lifting its head slightly as though tasting the air. Its tongue flickered in a slow, deliberate motion. The body followed, coiling fluidly across the stone floor. Each segment shifted with smooth precision, revealing scales that shimmered between bronze, green, and dark gold. The sheer mass of the creature was overwhelming. It stretched beyond the archway, disappearing into the shadows behind. Yet the visible portion alone spanned a length greater than any animal we had ever encountered. It moved with an almost regal grace, as though fully aware of its dominion over the ruins. The serpent slowed as it approached the center of the courtyard. It lifted its head again, surveying us with unblinking calm. The men stood frozen, not daring to breathe too deeply. The serpent's gaze passed over each of us, lingering only briefly. There was no overt hostility, yet the enormity of its presence communicated a warning, a simple, immutable truth that we were intruders here, tolerated only by its patience. Then, without altering its posture, the serpent lowered its head and continued across the courtyard. Its body slid along the stone floor, scales rasping softly against the surface. The sound echoed faintly through the ruins. As it passed, it brushed against a lower section of wall, causing dust to rise in small clouds. The wall bore fresh scratches in the wake of its passage. The serpent reached the descending steps leading into the subterranean passage. It paused briefly at the threshold, as though considering whether to enter. Then it dipped its head and slid effortlessly into the darkness, its massive body following with fluid motion. The sound of its scales brushing the stone faded steadily until only silence remained. The men released their breath collectively, some staggering slightly as the tension drained from their limbs. Dr. Larkin lowered his lantern, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. The encounter had exceeded any reasonable expectation, overwhelming even his capacity for measured analysis. We debated whether to continue our survey or return immediately to camp. The men favored retreat, arguing that the serpent's proximity placed us in unacceptable danger. Dr. Larkin, though reluctant to abandon the eastern structures, conceded that our safety took precedence. We retraced our steps toward camp, moving with sustained caution. The forest had regained some of its natural rhythm. Birds called intermittently. The leaves rustled in the wind. Yet beneath this regained normalcy lingered a subtle tension. Every sound carried the possibility of more movement beneath the ruins. As we neared camp, the ground trembled once more, this time with greater force. The men halted. We scanned the tree line, listening. The tremor persisted briefly, then subsided. A few distant branches snapped. A low rumble followed, resonating through the earth. When we reached camp, we found new markings near the southern boundary, fresh impressions in the soil, deeper than those from the previous night. The men regarded them with mounting unease. The serpent's movements suggested increasing proximity, perhaps even agitation. Whether it sensed our continued presence or merely patrolled its territory with greater vigilance, we could not determine. We fortified the camp as best we could, gathering stones to reinforce the fire ring and clearing the immediate perimeter of loose debris. Dr. Larkin instructed the men to keep their lanterns close and maintain watch rotations throughout the night. He spoke with unusual gravity, acknowledging the possibility that the serpent might return. As evening fell, the fire cast its familiar glow across the ruins. The men huddled near the flames, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. The forest beyond remained deceptively calm. Crickets chirped, a soft breeze rustled the leaves. Yet beneath these ordinary sounds lay a disquieting, current sense that something vast lay just beyond the reach of the firelight. Night deepened. Hours passed with only occasional rustling in the distance. The men relaxed slightly, though no one drifted into true sleep. Dr. Larkin walked the perimeter periodically, lantern held low. His silhouette moved steadily between the trees and shadows. Then, near midnight, a faint vibration pulsed through the ground, so soft at first that only those fully awake noticed. The vibration grew stronger, traveling through the soil like a distant drumbeat. The men straightened, gripping their blankets and weapons. The firelight flickered, as though disturbed by an unseen breath. A moment later, the dragging sound returned, slow, ponderous, deliberate. The giant snake was approaching. The sound grew louder, reverberating off the stone walls. Leaves shook free from branches. Small stones rolled across the ground. The serpent's presence felt immense, as if it carried the weight of the earth within its coils. The men exchanged fearful glances, yet remained still, understanding instinctively that movement might provoke a reaction. The sound stopped just beyond the tree line. Silence settled heavily. Then, from the shadows, a broad section of the serpent's body emerged, glimmering in the fire's glow. The creature circled the camp slowly, its scales reflecting patterns of amber and green. The ground quivered under its weight. It paused at intervals, lifting its head slightly, as though examining our defenses. It did not advance further. It did not attack. It simply observed us, the firelight flickering across its ridged scales and ancient amber eyes. After several long minutes, the serpent turned and slid back into the darkness, its movement fluid and soundless. The dragging diminished, then faded entirely. We remained awake until dawn. The serpent had revealed its capacity not only for power, but for restraint. Yet restraint, we realized, was no guarantee of safety. We could not predict when patience might give way to something else. Dawn arrived muted and gray, as though reluctant to unveil whatever the night had concealed. A faint mist drifted between the ruins, clinging to the broken walls and pillars like a shroud laid across ancient stone. None of us had truly slept. The few who drifted into brief unconsciousness woke abruptly at the slightest sound, the crackle of cooling embers, the rustle of leaves overhead, even the faint patter of dew falling from the branches. The serpent's enormous shadow had passed back into the darkness hours earlier, yet its presence lingered with oppressive weight, filling the air with a tension that no sunrise could lift. The men moved cautiously around the camp, avoiding the southern boundary where the deepest impressions remained. Fresh tracks wider and more defined than any previous ones curved around the perimeter. The soil bore the crisp outlines of ridged scales pressing with immense force. Some impressions overlapped older ones, indicating repeated circuits throughout the night. The serpent had monitored us more thoroughly than we realized. Its patience, once merely unnerving, now felt deliberate in a way that chilled us deeply. Dr. Larkin stood silently near the largest track, lantern still in hand from his final watch. His expression held none of the intellectual curiosity that had accompanied earlier discoveries. Instead, he carried a heavy, contemplative dread, as though wrestling with the implications of something too profound for immediate articulation. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged soft and low, barely above a whisper. He suggested that the serpent's behavior had shifted, not merely territorial, but reactive. Perhaps our continued presence had agitated it. Perhaps our exploration of the deeper chambers had crossed a threshold we did not understand. Regardless of interpretation, the conclusion was the same. We needed to leave the ruins. Yet departure was not a simple matter. Our camp lay deep within the complex. Retracing our route would require navigating narrow corridors, collapsing walls, and dense vegetation terrain where the serpent moved effortlessly, and we did not. The men understood the risk. As we gathered our gear, they spoke little, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Every sound beyond the ruin's edges seemed to echo with hidden intent. We broke camp by mid-morning, moving in a tight formation as we ascended the terrace near the central temple. The pathway wound through a corridor, flanked by tall, slender trees whose roots had split the stone beneath them. The air remained cool, but a heaviness clung to it, a sensation similar to the pressure felt before a storm. Birds circled high above the canopy, their calls sharp and sporadic, contrasting with the forest's subdued murmur. At the top of the terrace, we reached the courtyard we had crossed the previous day. Here the ground vibrated faintly, though only for a brief moment. The tremor was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to halt the men in place. Leaves shivered on the branches above. Dr. Larkin listened intently, his brow furrowed. When no further tremor followed, he urged us forward, though the unease remained. We descended the northern steps and entered a narrow corridor bordered by crumbled stone. The passage had served as our route into the complex originally, but now it felt altered, darker, narrower, the shadows deeper. The air carried a faint warmth, not from the sun, but from something beneath our feet. The men stepped lightly, as though afraid to disturb the ground. As we approached the corridor's midpoint, a clear sign of the serpent's recent activity caught our attention. One of the supporting walls had collapsed overnight. The fallen blocks lay scattered across the floor, some cracked in half. The collapse bore no resemblance to natural decay. Instead, long, sweeping impressions across the debris indicated that a massive weight had pressed through the corridor with deliberate force. The serpent had passed here likely during the night, perhaps even while we lay awake at camp. We climbed over the rubble carefully, testing each foothold. The men moved in near silence. Only the steady rhythm of breath and the scrape of boots against stone broke the stillness. Beyond the corridor lay a small plaza overgrown with vegetation. Large ferns unfurled across the stone floor, their fronds trembling slightly in the faint wind. The ruin's outer wall stood to our right, partially intact but uneven. Something about the arrangement of the debris struck us as odd. Leaves had been swept aside in a wide arc, revealing fresh soil beneath. The pattern bore the unmistakable curvature of a massive coil. The serpent had rested here. Dr. Larkin crouched near the cleared patch, gently brushing aside debris. He pointed toward a series of faint indentations along the edge of the soil-subtle marks left by the serpent's scales. The impressions radiated outward from a central point, as though the creature had curled upon itself, perhaps to listen, perhaps to wait. We left the plaza swiftly, rejoining the main path that led toward the outer edges of the ruins. The path rose gradually, offering a vantage point over the northern structures. From this height, the expanse of the ruins became clearer, the outline of temples, plazas, and corridors forming a labyrinth woven with nature's reclamation. For a moment, awe overshadowed fear. The scale of the lost city impressed upon us the magnitude of what had once existed here. Yet the serpent's dominion across this ancient landscape cast a sobering shadow over the scene. As we descended toward the exit path, a deep rumble trembled through the earth, stronger than any before. The men halted, gripping branches and stone for balance. Dust billowed from the treetops. A distant flock of birds erupted into flight, scattering wildly across the sky. The tremor persisted longer this time, rolling beneath us like a submerged tide. Then the dragging sound emerged closer now, heavier, bearing a rhythm that quickened our pulse. It approached from the central ruins, moving with unmistakable intention. The serpent was not merely patrolling. It was following us. Dr. Larkin urged us forward, his voice tense but controlled. We hastened toward the outer edge of the complex, navigating the narrowing path. The dense vegetation ahead rustled in waves. Branches snapped with sharp, echoing cracks. The serpent moved parallel to us, concealed but unmistakably present. We quickened our pace, nearly jogging through the uneven terrain. The men stumbled occasionally over roots and loose stones, but adrenaline propelled them onward. The serpent continued its parallel movement, matching our speed effortlessly. Its presence pressed against the forest like a gathering storm. We reached a clearing near the northern boundary, a place where the forest thinned, allowing patches of sunlight to penetrate the canopy. The stone path here widened briefly before bending sharply. The men paused briefly to catch their breath, but the reprieve was short-lived. A massive shadow shifted beyond the bend. The serpent emerged from the forest with a speed and certainty we had not yet witnessed. Its head rose above the ferns, glimmering in the filtered light. Its scales reflected bronze and dark emerald hues, and its eyes fixed upon us with an unsettling clarity. It did not coil or prepare to strike. Instead, it advanced steadily, each movement fluid and inevitable. We stood transfixed. The serpent's presence overwhelmed the senses. Its mass dwarfed every creature we had encountered in the wilderness. Its head alone spanned a width greater than a man's chest. Its tongue flicked in and out, sampling the air with slow deliberation. Dr. Larkin stepped forward slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, as though recognizing the significance of the moment. His breath trembled with effort. The serpent halted a short distance from us. It raised its head higher, surveying the group. The tension in the air tightened, each heartbeat magnified by the weight of the creature's scrutiny. Then, without warning, the serpent shifted its body with sudden force. The ground shook violently beneath us. Loose stones slid across the earth. Several men stumbled. A large segment of the serpent's body swung outward, striking a fallen tree and splintering it into fragments. The sound echoed across the ruins like thunder. The message was unmistakable. We were to leave now. Dr. Larkin shouted for the men to retreat toward the exit path. Panic erupted, but it was directed, purposeful panic. The men scrambled through the underbrush, staying low, avoiding sudden gestures. The serpent did not pursue immediately. Instead, it watched our retreat with steady, measured movements. When we reached the final stretch of forest before the outer boundary, the serpent shifted again. Its body rippled with immense strength, sending vibrations through the ground. It advanced a short distance, enough to remind us that distance did not equate to safety. We broke into a full run. Branches whipped our faces. Roots caught at our boots. The path narrowed between tall trunks and thick vines, forcing us into single file. The serpent followed parallel to the route, its movement matching ours with eerie precision. Though it never closed the gap fully, its presence remained constant, guiding us toward the exit as if shepherding unwanted guests to the edge of its domain. At last, the forest began to thin. Sunlight grew brighter. The soil shifted from the aged ruins to unclaimed wilderness. The men surged forward, driven by exhaustion and fear. When we reached a stream that marked the boundary of the ruins, most collapsed to their knees, gasping for breath. We turned back only once. The serpent had stopped at the line where vegetation thickened again. It rose partially above the brush, its gaze fixed upon us. For a moment, the forest fell silent. The serpent remained motionless, its amber eyes unblinking. Then it withdrew slowly, disappearing into the depths of the ruins with the same fluid grace with which it had emerged. It did not follow further. The boundary was clear. We were no longer within its territory. The relief that washed over us felt muted by the enormity of what we had witnessed. Dr. Larkin steadied himself against a tree, his breath shallow. The men gathered their remaining supplies, their movements slow and weary. The journey back through the wilderness would be long, but none feared it as they feared a single hour within the serpent's domain. As the ruins faded behind us, I felt a quiet reverence for the creature that had spared us not out of mercy, perhaps, but from a deeper logic we could never hope to understand. The Mayan cities had endured centuries of abandonment, yet they remained guarded by a force older and more powerful than any stone temple. When we finally reached the outskirts of the settlements days later, we bore the weight of our experience in silence. We had not returned with artifacts or inscriptions. We carried only the memory of a presence that defied reason, a serpent vast enough to shape the land around it, commanding reverence not through myth, but through undeniable reality. I recorded every detail in my journal, not for acclaim, not for explanation, but because experiences of such magnitude demand remembrance. And though scholars may dismiss our account, and future expeditions may seek evidence long erased by the forest, one truth remains certain in my mind. The ruins were never abandoned. They were merely reclaimed by something older than the cities themselves.